Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's Trail Expert Network. I see you all trickling in. Welcome, welcome. My name is Yvonne Mwangi, and I am the Trail Resources and Planning Manager here at Rails to Trails Conservancy. Our topic for this webinar today is Trails and Utilities, a Powerful Partnership. This webinar today is a service of our Trail Expert Network. It's a learning and information exchange platform that is provided for trail professionals by RTC. In addition to the webinar today, we also provide the services shown on your screen, including an exclusive newsletter and peer-to-peer learning on our 10 Facebook group.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today from across the country. I know I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So, as more communities are looking to develop trails and fill gaps in trail networks, utility corridors can become key strategies for providing these important community connections. Sharing a trail corridor with the utility is not only an efficient use of space, but it also has the potential to defray the costs associated with trail development. Many types of utilities, including water, sewer, natural gas, electric, and fiber optic, can have their lines buried or encased beneath a trail, while telecommunications, cable, and electric utilities can run above a corridor using air rights. A spatial analysis conducted by RTC revealed that more than 400 multi-use trails across the country coexist within electric utility corridor rights-of-way, and approximately 17% of rail trails in the United States are at least partially shared with this type of utility corridor. Trail and electric co-use have become so popular that Colorado recently passed a bill aimed at streamlining and accelerating the process. Of course, utility and recreational trail co-use is not without its complications, specifically when faced with the unique needs of utility companies. However, with properly negotiated maintenance and land agreements, utilities can have a minimal effect and even offer a host of benefits on the trail, its neighbors, and its users. Today, we invited our panelists to share their expertise in participating in trail and utilities co-use arrangements. You'll hear about the St. Ignace to Trout Lake Trail in Michigan, developed several decades ago with a long history of successful co-use. We'll also learn about how a project in York County, Pennsylvania is taking advantage of existing trail infrastructure to create opportunities for broadband installation and has successfully utilized recent federal funding sources for the dual benefit to the community served. And finally, we'll hear from WEC Energy Group, a company that has been on the forefront of these types of partnerships in Wisconsin. We hope that their lessons learned can help trail managers watching today as they navigate the process. And now I am pleased to introduce our panelists. First is Mary Moore. Mary is currently the Forest Supervisor of the Hiawatha National Forest in Gladstone, Michigan in the Eastern region, where she has been since June 2021. Prior to joining the Hiawatha National Forest, Mary worked in Wyoming on the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Colorado and on the Pike and San Isabel National Forests in Cimarron and Comanche National Grasslands, and in California on the Stanislaus National Forest and the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. She received her MS from Johns Hopkins University in Environmental Science and Policymaking with a focus on hydrology, and her BA from the University of Virginia in Environmental Science with a focus on ecology. Next is Silas Chamberlain. Silas is Vice President for Economic Development at the York County Economic Alliance, where he oversees a variety of economic development initiatives, including York County's YOCO Fiber Broadband Task Force and the York County Trail Towns Program, which is now active in 7 communities. In addition to his roles in economic development, Silas holds a PhD in environmental history and is author of On the Trail, A History of American Hiking, which was published by Yale University Press in 2016. And finally, Dawn Nye. Dawn is the Director of Real Estate Services for WEC Energy Group and oversees all real estate right-of-way and surveying functions for 7 utilities covering 4 states. Dawn and her team are responsible for the acquisition of easements, purchases of properties, management of leases, licenses and permits, management of fee-owned property, and selling of real estate assets to meet the strategic initiative for the corporation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary for our first presentation.
So good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending upon which time zone you're in. Before I share specifics about the Trout Lake Trail, I wanted to just provide a little bit of background information for you all. So Michigan is 2 distinct land features, often referenced as mitts or 2 hands. So it's the Upper Peninsula and then the Lower Peninsula, which are connected by the Mackinac Bridge, which is shown here in this image. I would also be remiss if I did not acknowledge that all of the Hiawatha land base lies within the Anishinaabe ceded territory, which is ceded territory for about 15 tribes. The Lower Peninsula is more urban with high population densities, and the Upper Peninsula is more rural with lesser populations. In the early 2000s, the state of Michigan established 2 goals, amongst others, but specific to trails. 1 was increase trails tourism, and 2, establish a trail for everyone. So again, looking at this prominent feature of the Mackinac Bridge, which connects those 2 landscapes, it sees almost 750,000 crossings annually. And the Mackinac Bridge Authority actually hosts special events weekly in support of different user groups to allow them to cross the bridge to connect these 2 land features. As you cross the bridge from the Lower Peninsula to the Upper Peninsula, you enter into the gateway town of St. Ignace. In 2018, St. Ignace, which has a population of about 2,500, was the first designated trail town in the Upper Peninsula. The concept between a trail town is that the town is officially recognized as a place where people can get information about a specific trail, find lodging and meals while they're exploring and recreating, and then also find supplies associated with that trail use. As you all know, trails connect communities, provide for local economy, and are an opportunity to connect with natural and cultural landscapes. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about Trout Lake Trail, or what we refer to as Trail Number 2. So the trail begins in downtown St. Ignace and travels north or northwest to a small village called Trout Lake, which has a population of about 379 people. The trail is 26 miles in length. It's all on the Hiawatha National Forest and is mixed use. It has both motorized and non-motorized use, to include both summer and winter motorized activities, and then portions of the North Country National Scenic Trail are also within this 26-mile section. Next slide. Here's a general map. And so if you're looking kind of midway in the map, you can kind of see where the 2 land masses almost join together. That's where the Mackinac Bridge is. And that's also the gateway community of St. Ignace is on the upper portion of that in that little point. As you travel north and northwest on the map, you do reach the small village of Trout Lake. Next slide. So a little bit about the trail's history. So the trail was an abandoned rail corridor, which became a utility corridor, and then also became a trail in the 1980s. It is officially listed as a Rails to Trails Trail. It's a lot of words there. Next slide. So we did want to kind of highlight that in the 1980s, rail banking was kind of a new concept, and this transition from an abandoned rail corridor to a utilities corridor occurred before the '83 Trails Act. Michigan Bell became So it was transferred to Michigan Bell, who had an interest in kind of working with state and local levels, whereas the railroad was not as interested. Again, rail banking was a fairly relatively new thing, little really unknown and not necessarily supported until after the '83 Trails Act. So the Soo Line actually approached the utilities company, Michigan Bell, and sold the 26-mile corridor in a single transaction. Michigan Bell later became a subsidiary of AT&T in 1984, and Michigan Bell is still the legal entity that provides telecommunication services in the state of Michigan under the AT&T name. While Michigan Bell to date has not laid fiber optics in this corridor, it does maintain an easement to do so in perpetuity. So next slide. So a little bit about this trail. This trail is all located on the Hiawatha National Forest in the Upper Peninsula. It does pass amongst woodlands, wetlands, and open green spaces. Some of the positives from this feature is the abandoned railroad provided the forest with instant infrastructure. So as you can see, a corridor was kind of established and set in place upon the acquisition of this feature. It does have some challenges though, and some potential future challenges, again, as that fiber optic cable has not been laid. And so, you know, if AT&T/Michigan Bell did choose to engage in that conversation, then we would have to try to figure out how to manage that multiple use aspect of this feature. Again, we, the Forest Service, manage for multiple uses all the time. So trail closures and trail impacts are something we take into consideration regardless of the activity, whether it's a timber sale, whether it's recreation use and or potential wildlife corridors or wildlife closures, etc. So we're pretty well versed in that. Next slide. So currently, we do not have an existing partnership with Michigan Bell, but again, they do maintain that easement. So we do have a partnership through the utility use and aspect of this feature. Again, we would be looking for opportunities if they did want to put the fiber optics in place to actually keep the feature as is. If not, try and look for some areas of opportunity to actually improve it, like maybe establish some better wetland crossings, etc., as they do put that fiber optic cable in place in the future. Again, we do have some existing partnerships that help us maintain this feature. One is the state of Michigan through the Natural Resources Department. And we also do have a couple agreements in place with some of our local snowmobile clubs to help support this feature and this infrastructure. So that is a little bit about the Trout Lake Trail here on the Hiawatha National Forest and its shared space with Michigan Bell Utility Corridor.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was very informative and such a good example of co-use. All right, now I am going to pass it to Silas.
Great. Thank you, our RTC, for including York County in this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we completed at the end of 2020 and have since been building off of to install broadband fiber internet infrastructure underneath an existing rail to trail conversion. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of context on why we were concerned about broadband expansion in York County. You can see here the census data on broadband access, and probably like many of the counties where you all live, there's areas that are well served in York County, and then there are large swaths of the county where at best a third of households don't have internet access, high-speed internet access, but in many cases up to two-thirds, 71% or so, don't have access. So when we look at how we can make our community more competitive, and some of these communities that are located in rural areas attract and retain residents, broadband expansion is a big piece of that. Next slide. And to flesh out that census data with it, which is imperfect in a lot of ways, we talked to our community about why broadband access was important. and really found from a variety of perspectives, and this won't shock any of you because it really came to light during the pandemic, that broadband's important for working from home, remote working and telecommuting, students accessing homework, businesses trying to do online transactions or maintain e-commerce, public safety, and just general quality of life. Next slide. So when we had the opportunity to allocate some of our CARES Act funding, which if you recall was the 2020 version of the rescue plan that helped provide funding directly to counties so that they could address the needs that arose during COVID and sort of the emergency response to COVID. When we had the opportunity to allocate funding, we spent some of that funding on doing a countywide broadband study that said, okay, if we were to expand broadband infrastructure across York County, here's what it would look like. And we developed the image on right, which is the same sort of scale as you just saw in the census data, but really shows the network of middle mile fiber that we wanted to build out, which is roughly 333 miles of broadband fiber. The obvious question is, how do you get that started and how do you do it quickly? And how do you sync that up with some of the federal funding that was available at the time? Next slide. And so in looking at the census data and considering our underserved parts of the county, we really started to hone in on the York Heritage Rail Trail as a potential option as one of our low-hanging fruit corridors for broadband. If you look at the image on left, you can see the original route of the railroad, obviously connecting lots of small communities. Just off the image is the outskirts of Baltimore to the south and Harrisburg, our state capital, to the north, and this corridor cutting right through the heart of the county. And over a series of decades, our county's rail trail authority and a number of other partners have converted that rail line to a very popular multi-use trail. So as the trail exists today, you can see the rough parameters of it on the right. It connects to a trail in northern Maryland, but the portion in York County is roughly 26 miles long, owned and maintained by the County of York's Parks Department, which will come back to being an important point, and has attracted statewide attention because it's such a high quality trail, but also because it has a scenic railroad that runs alongside it. So there's a lot going on this trail corridor, which is potentially a con to expanding broadband infrastructure. But as you'll see on the next slide, there were a lot of reasons why we thought this had a lot of potential and it's worth doing. Namely, because this rail trail is so centrally located that when you plot the number of businesses and jobs and really households, although the stat's not on here, in close proximity to this trail, it represents about a third of all York County businesses are within a mile of the York Heritage Rail Trail and 17% of all jobs. So we knew if we could use this corridor, we would be expanding infrastructure that's going to touch a lot of households, a lot of businesses, and support a lot of York County workers. So our project under the CARES Act was to create 16 miles, so not the entire trail, but most of it from the city of York down to the Maryland border, to use it to create a backbone of fiber infrastructure the entire way. This, as I said, would extend access into underserved parts of York County. And then we would circle back and also put wireless antennas at two of our very popular trailheads, Brillhart Station and Hanover Junction, both as a proof of concept that, we spent a lot of money and we have this conduit buried, but nobody can see it. So we wanted some way to show that it was functional. But we also learned after installing it that there's a lot of popularity around having wireless at popular trailheads for a number of reasons. The key reason that this corridor became so attractive to us, and something I'll return to in a moment, is that early in the development of the trail, there was an opportunity to install conduit underneath the trail to provide MCI, which is a precursor to Verizon, with a corridor through south central York County for telecom. And at the time, the county had the foresight to say, okay, we'll provide this corridor to you, but if we do, we want you to install conduit for us and leave it empty, not knowing what the use of it would be in the future. So as we looked at this county-owned corridor of space, we also knew that there was this excess conduit underneath, and that helped us move very quickly forward with our project. So the next slide shows Some of the outreach we did, obviously popular trail, not so popular when you say there's going to be heavy equipment that shuts down portions of it. We managed to keep the trail open the entire time we were out there. We gave ample notice in English and in Spanish on websites and with these construction notices on the trail themselves. And then the next slide shows what the work looked like. So because there was conduit under the trail, a big piece of this was going in and creating access points that they call handholds at major intersections where we would want future connections to broadband, and then pooling fiber through this existing conduit, which actually after several decades of being buried empty and really underutilized, was in great condition. So we were able to pool long distances of fiber through it. We had a couple hiccups with freezing conduit and things like that, but really we're able to pool 16 miles of fiber in a matter of weeks because we had this publicly accessible conduit available. And then of course had some great moments with our county commissioners to celebrate that we were able to do this with CARES Act funding. Next slide, please. So you can see here that the cost was about $1.2 million for construction and for engineering. Obviously, the bulk of that was construction, and then a piece of it was engineering. But the key thing here is that because the county had the foresight to make a partnership that allowed for the installation of conduit, even when they didn't know that it would be used for broadband infrastructure, we were able to save $4 to $6 million in engineering and construction costs because we didn't have to do any directional drilling or boring. We didn't have to do rail plowing, which is, when equipment's on the track itself and trenching along the side of it and then installing conduit. And of course, because it was a county park and an asset we had already developed for recreational purposes, there were no acquisition or easement costs. So we were able to really fast track a project and do it for a much cheaper cost because we had worked on developing the trail. And it's the icing on the cake in some ways, but also the most important piece of this, that we already have an active Trail Towns program in 5 of the communities that were along this broadband infrastructure that we're expanding. And we had already been working with them on saying, we want more people to come off the trail into the community. We want more people to live in your communities because of the trail access. And so being able to now turn to them and say, not only are we working with you on the recreational aspects of the trail, we're also going to bring fiber to the home and fiber to your businesses off of this middle mile that's now been constructed. It really takes a program that, was mostly about small business development and tourism promotion and adds this whole very significant quality of life piece to our Trail Towns program as well. So just a couple quick lessons learned that I think, we found here in York County to be true and is probably true in your community. The decisions that were made during trail development and decades ago ended up saving us significant funding as we embarked on this project. And so the more that you can explore opportunities to install conduit or fiber infrastructure as part of your trail project, even if you don't know what the immediate use is going to be, you can ultimately save millions of dollars in the process. And because you can sometimes partner with broadband providers who might be looking to install this infrastructure, you can get some cost savings off of those kinds of dig once policies, where if somebody's already installing something and they have to come back and repair it, then you can sometimes get trail out of that process. In the case of the Heritage Rail Trail, when we acquired the railroad, it was everything. It was, there were no easements held by the railroad. It was, ownership of it. We have a similar trail in another part of the county that we're currently developing, and the acquisition of that trail left utility rights of way to the railroad company. So it is something to think about as you're developing a trail and you're negotiating that acquisition process, that even if you can just get ownership of municipally held utility rights of way, that's a big sort of foot in the door to future development of broadband opportunities. Again, even if you don't have those as a short-term goal. Because we use this rail trail as a utility corridor, it started to change the way that our county commissioners viewed the trail. And I think helped them understand that although they get a lot of credit for these trails because of the recreational potential, there are also all these added benefits for the county. And I'd like to believe that it also led them to funding other trail projects in the county, and in general, starting to think of this broader outdoor economy that the trail is at the heart of, but there's all these other positive spin-offs. And I think if you have planning commissions or MPOs or RPOs that you're working with, trying to look at the opportunities to align trail development with their broadband expansion strategies is a really good starting point to help that conversation of not just having trails and utilities, but merging the two together. And then finally, as I showed you, we did not embark on broadband expansion because of our Trail Towns program, but it really put our Trail Towns program on steroids in a lot of positive ways, because these rural communities where there's not great cell service, there's no public Wi-Fi, now we're going to have some of the highest high-speed internet possible. It makes it easier to attract residents and businesses, but it also makes it a lot easier for tourists coming to the community to learn about the local stores, restaurants, places they can go. So, the more you can layer those benefits between trail development and utilities and your community development goals, I think it makes for a much more compelling project. So that's my whirlwind version of what we're doing in York County.
Thank you so much, Silas. Some very impressive strategy going on in York County that I'm sure our attendees would like to replicate. All right, and now I will pass the microphone over to Dawn.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. So I am from WEC Energy Group, and WEC Energy is one of the utilities that we own in Southeast Wisconsin. So we started on this journey a long time ago. So I kind of want to go through the history and then kind of how we're working with the different communities that we serve currently. So next slide. So the main focus on where the trail development has been, like I said, is Southeast Wisconsin, and also the Fox Valley, which is kind of just west of Green Bay, kind of central Wisconsin. And next slide. So here's, we kind of have a unique history from a utility perspective, in that the company was started as the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. And because of the unknowns if the electric utility industry would succeed, the company started as a streetcar company, and also our headquarters, which I'll show you later, was also kind of set up in case the utility failed as a hotel. So next slide. So this is a map. It's actually hanging in our library that kind of shows the corridors of the electric railway system. So this is looking west. So from Lake Michigan, you can see Milwaukee, and then the rail system head south, west, and then kind of northwest, and also north. But this was an old map that kind of shows the start of the rail system. And this is another one that just shows it from a different perspective. So you can see Milwaukee there on the east, and then heading out all the way to Watertown, and then north and southwest. So the company was founded in 1896, and they purchased all the railway corridors in fee. So that's where it started. And then additionally, we've acquired a lot of utility corridors that we also purchased in fee. But for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, there were a total of 190 miles. And then that was merged in Wisconsin Electric Power Company in 1938. And the railway system was operated until 1951. So this is our headquarters in downtown Milwaukee, but this was actually originally the Milwaukee Interurban Terminal. So the first floor was a terminal area with 2 waiting areas and 13 car tracks. So you can kind of tell where those big doors are on the bottom. That's where the trains used to go in and out of the building. And it was the largest terminal of its kind in the US at the time. So it started January 1st of 1901. Oh, sorry, if you could just back up. Also on like I mentioned before, the 4th floor, which is now where our executives sit, that is the area that was kind of preemptively set up to become a hotel if the utility should fail. So they're kind of suites set up with kind of a sitting area and a bathroom, and now they use it for conference space, but they were getting ready for it to become a hotel should the utility end of things fail. So kind of the company history, like I said, we're in a unique position because of the amount of land that we own, not only from the railway corridors, but all of the utility corridors that we do own. And we started trail development back in the 1970s. Our first license became active in 1975. And we have been continuing to work with the different communities to co-occupy with the recreational trails in the areas that we serve. Right now, there are over 122 miles on our property that we own that are either existing or planned throughout Wisconsin and Michigan. And really, it's kind of been a fun development to see how the connectivity happens with these different municipalities, not only for recreational use, but now we're seeing it, people using it to get to and from work, and really connecting both the urban and the suburban areas together. And those are just some fun retro Wisconsin Electric Power Company signs that I found. So kind of our processes for granting licenses, we really work, we're contacted by the municipalities or the counties. We work with them and really do our due diligence because we do have electric, natural gas, steam, and also transmission utility facilities. We do also allow some co-occupation for other utilities, be it either telecom or municipalities. But obviously we're kind of protective on making sure that we have the use of our facilities for our utilities, and then also for the municipalities to use. So we'll really work out agreements where it's cost neutral for the company, but if we know, let's say that a natural gas pipeline is going to be replaced within the next 5 years, we'll work with that municipality to get an agreement in place that they would wait to, say, pave it until after we do the replacement, to also save them money as well as us. So we really work diligently with our different municipalities as well as the transmission company and our different stakeholders within the company. The Route of the Badger does act as a conduit for us a lot of times, connecting us with the municipalities to work out agreements with them. Next slide. So this is the Route of the Badger. I know this is kind of hard to see, but you can also go on their website. But this shows the existing trails as well as the proposed, and then there are some co-occupation with city streets, just trying to connect all the different municipalities for Southeast Wisconsin. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. It's so exciting to see such a strong champion for trails on the utility side of things. All right, well, we are going to open it up to questions. We've been receiving a lot of good questions throughout the presentations. If you have a question now, feel free to put that in the Q&A box. And our first question is for Silas. There was a lot of interest in the chat about how the agreement was structured between the broadband company rather, and the county. So could you tell us a little bit more about what type of agreement was structured between the broadband company and York? And also, did the rail trail or the county charge a lease fee for the broadband infrastructure? Was that an annual fee? Was it per foot? If not, how was the lease determined? And that was many questions within a question. So yeah. Feel free to answer bits and pieces and I can remind you of what
well, that sounds good. And I think the beginning of my answer might preempt some of those questions. So I probably didn't make it clear enough, but there is no private provider in this scenario so far. So for our middle mile construction underneath the rail trail, it's a county-owned asset. We hired a construction company and, fiber company to build it for us. We, then pay for service. So it's lit, with internet service. But no private provider came in there. So when we issued our contracts for construction, we could specify, it needs to be returned to its original condition. We could sync them up with our county parks department and say, here's the trail mix that we want you to use as the surface. So that it pretty much looks like it wasn't touched. And we could also specify, we want you to minimize the impact on the trail in terms of keeping it open. You need to tell us what portion you're going to be on in a given week so we can notify the public. So because we were in the driver's seat, we were able to, make sure all that happened. The part where the private providers are going to come in is now building off of that into the communities, which then it's just a traditional, broadband expansion project on street rights of way, aerial connections. Yeah, so we didn't run into issues where we were, dealing with somebody damaging the trail because it was really us running the project.
Got it. Okay. Well, thanks for that clarification.
And I would just add, because I think one of the pieces of the question too is, if you're giving access to a broadband company to come in and use that right of way, there should be some negotiation that happens up front. Obviously, you want to expand broadband in your community, but you also want to maintain this, public asset that you have, that's the trail. So I don't know if, some of the examples I think of, the trail being destroyed, in some cases not being able to reopen. I would hope that the entity that owns those trails is doing some of that negotiation on the front, piece of it, to say, we do want it restored, here's how we want it restored, because the cost of a private company going out and securing public rights of way is incredibly high. So the access that you have on that public corridor is incredibly valuable. So you do have a right, you have a bargaining chip to say, if you want access to this, here's what you're going to have to do. And a lot of times that can be a lease agreement as well, so that you're actually generating revenue to put back into the trail.
Absolutely. That's such a great point, that the trail manager does, have an important asset, and they can leverage that to make sure that the trail is improved, or at least is maintained in its current condition.
So if I may add to, as a land manager, it is pretty critical to understand the use of the trail system. And so, are there opportunities where you are not using that trail because maybe it is a little bit more sensitive, or there's some wetlands or some soft spots, etc., and use it? So again, it depends on the type of use, the timing of that use, and making sure that it's compatible with those multiple entities. The broadband, the optic line, the power line, the utilities, and the recreational opportunity as well.
Thank you for that, Mary. And Mary, we also have a question specifically for you. Can you clarify if Michigan Bell has ever used the corridor? You mentioned that they have the easement to lay the fiber optic in the future, but have they ever used it for any other types of cables? And if not, what's your relationship with them? Are they just kind of like a silent partner at this point?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, so Michigan Bell ran into some financial challenges in the 80s, and that's how they were acquired, through AT&T. So yes, to date, they have not laid any sort of fiber optic cable, etc., within the feature. But with that being said, the state of Michigan, much like Silas was alluding to, is doing kind of that broadband analysis statewide. And because the Upper Peninsula, the UP, is pretty rural, we are anticipating seeing a lot of impacts. And like Silas alluded to, it is easier to reach out to your public land managers and get and establish uses on those lands, rather than going out and acquiring private easements and or acquiring that land. So we are anticipating a potential ask. And so while it may not be Michigan Bell and AT&T laying fiber optic, we are thinking there may be some broadband and or other opportunities that we will be seeing in the near future associated with that corridor and other like corridors here in the area. So we're poised for that ask, and like Silas alluded to, trying to have some of those early conversations to say, yes, we would like to support that that infrastructure, but how can we maintain the integrity of the system and or improve the system where needed? I saw one of the earlier questions was that, you know, we acquired the feature as is. And so from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So while it is a sustainable, usable feature, there's always areas for improved drainages. There's areas of opportunity where we can connect disconnected wetlands with newer features, et cetera. So that would be our hope in the long run in working with future partners.
Great. Well, you'll have to keep us updated on how that process goes. Maybe we'll have to have a part 2 of this webinar. All right. The next question is for Dawn. How can trail managers be best prepared to engage with a utility company and request access for trail development? What are your recommendations to trail managers seeking this type of partnership?
Well, for us, it's just been, you know, working with the different municipalities and counties over time and really building that relationship and rapport. I know some of the counties or municipalities that we started with, it was a little rocky to start because our focus obviously is safety and also customer satisfaction. So we want to benefit the communities, but we also want to make sure that we're very transparent and clear and concise in our communication to the customers. So I feel like those relationships have continued to develop and improve over time, and they understand what our expectations are and how we value those relationships. And so I would just, you know, reach out. We again might be in a little bit of a different situation. I know some utilities don't own a lot of land. We are quite the opposite. But again, it's worth having a conversation to see how you can come to some sort of agreement to co-occupy those spaces.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned safety. Could you talk a little bit more about how you handle liability issues on the trail?
So we do include that in our licenses. So we are indemnified by whomever we're working with the trail. Knock on wood, we've not had any problems in all these years. So we've had a very good working relationship, and we set very clear expectations, you know, that safety precautions have to be laid out, both for those using the trails as well as those working on the trails. So we've been very fortunate in those relationships and not had any issues.
That's great to hear. And are there any design requirements that you have for when the trail is constructed to make sure it's safe?
Yeah, so that's a lot of the due diligence. There's a, you know, it's quite a process to get to. We actually have you know, an active license agreement. Again, you know, seeing what the design is, and then we will work with the municipality, you know, where we know that we have infrastructure that cannot be, you know, this kind of the critical infrastructure versus just maybe a service line, and we'll, you know, have them either alter that location or put some additional safety equipment down just to protect our utility facilities, so that those occupations can happen together.
Thank you. And Mary and Silas, I want to open it up to you about any liability considerations that you've taken.
Yeah, so I'll get it kicked off. So for our case, it really depends, you know, so our situation is a little bit different than Dawn's. You know, we are the land-based holder, and different entities, to including utilities, have either right-of-ways or easements at which we maintain and or support access to. So it depends on who is putting in the feature. If we're putting in the feature, then oftentimes the liability is, you know, using it at your own risk. And if a third party is putting in the feature and wants to maintain it, then we often are asking that party to carry some sort of liability, and we're permitting that feature to that third party. So on our case, it kind of depends. You know, the federal government believes in all users using the woods, and kind of how you choose to use it as how you use your public lands, but you are using it at a personal risk.
And I'll just add, I'd mentioned that our trail is owned by the County of York. The process that we use is we have a county rail trail authority, which is a public authority that technically is under the umbrella of the county, but the authority develops the trail, owns it for a time, assumes the liability while they own it, and then it's transferred to the county as a county park, and that's handled as any other county asset or recreational use. But just to flip that on its head a little bit, one of the things that we really like about using trails as a corridor for broadband in particular is that there's very few other corridors of linear space where you have such little intrusion. So, down a typical street, you'll have, all sorts of, individual projects that could sever a line. If you're going aerially, you'll have people running into utility poles and knocking them down. So all just the stuff that happens in the course of just having infrastructure in a busy right of way. One of the reasons that we really like the rail trail right of way is that it's a county park. There will be digging and trenching that happens periodically. There are street crossings, but it really minimizes sort of the long-term liability after you're connecting customers and worried about severing service, to have it on a public right of way like that, where you can really manage what else is happening in the corridor. So we feel like it, managed our risk from a broadband perspective as well.
Thank you for that. Dawn, another question for you. What is the proximity of trails to the power infrastructure? And how recently have been trails added to your corridors? And since you've been doing this over time, have those distance requirements shifted?
Okay, so we have new trail agreements that have been in place. I think we've come out with, I want to say 4 in the last 2 years. So they're actually happening more often than they had in the past. I think probably with Route of the Badger, that's probably been increasing that development of trails. As far as the distance from our utility facilities, that really hasn't changed over time, unless, like I said, there is some sort of a unique situation, where it's a very critical infrastructure, then we'll just have, again, either more space or more of barrier put up to protect the utility facilities. What was the third or second question? Sorry.
Has any of that changed over time, your requirements?
No, that's been pretty standard. They really have not shifted since the 70s.
Great. Silas, you mentioned how your initiative has been really useful in getting decision makers more invested in the trail. Have you seen a similar shift with the general public, be they trail users or non-trail users?
I think we have a little bit. I think our trails will always be most popular because of the recreational, piece of it. It's just people love their local trail for good reason. But I think especially in the boroughs, which, in Pennsylvania, the small communities are the ones that are starting to almost return to the railroad as sort of like the centerpiece of their community. The trail coming through certainly helped with that. And, and a lot of the communities have now had the trail for a couple decades, but putting broadband infrastructure under it is just like another affirmation that this is sort of like the key corridor through the community. And I think over time, as we build out those fiber to the premise networks, with the private providers, those public-private partnerships, and people are actually getting, very high speed internet, and they know it's originating because of that project under the rail trail, that connection will start to happen. Where we saw it most tangibly in the short term was being able, to have the same conversations with our commissioners where, we're talking about the Heritage Rail Trail and how it's saving these millions of dollars and, speaking in very pragmatic terms, and then being able to turn around and say, what you could do with your Rescue Act funds? You could give $500,000 to this trail project. You could give $300,000 to this trail feasibility study, or you could, put it into these public assets. And so being able to bring that into one conversation and not make it feel like it's totally separate things, I think was like immediate impact on just the way that we talk about trails. And I know other communities have experienced that, particularly with talking through the use of Rescue Act funding and, the idea that this is funding that's going to help you recover from the pandemic, but it's also going to trails and parks and open space in some communities. And we certainly saw that happen here, but broadband was sort of the foot in the door to help that conversation happen.
Thanks, Silas. That's really compelling. All right, the next question. How do utility companies and managers deal with security concerns? John, do you want to take a stab at this one first?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer on that. It is a case basis. Again, talking about those partnerships, not only with the municipalities, but also with the people that live along our corridors. We really reach out to them on an annual basis, have them know where to report if there are any concerns, be it safety or people dumping or people misusing the property. Because again, it's not just our utility facilities, it's also the recreational trails and other utilities that are on those corridors. So again, working with the relationships to encourage the conversation is kind of how we work with it, as well as the local police or sheriff's departments.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I will just add to, much like Dawn alluded to, it's really just educating folks around the use of the trail. The large portion of the Trout Lake Trail is on federal land. So again, we have our own law enforcement that police the feature. But for other trail systems across the forest, they are connected through easements on private property at which the state maintains. And so again, it's really one of those things that's in everyone's best interest to behave on those trail systems so that those segments are not lost. And or now you have a fragmented trail system. So it's really about that education component and education piece of saying, hey, let's behave on this trail so that we can keep it for future users.
Thanks, Mary. All right, we have another question. It's about standardizing access of utilities for trails within a company's footprint. So one of the things we do have on our toolbox page, which has been shared in the chat, are some standard processes that the electric company in my region, Southeast Pennsylvania, has published recently. So that's PICO. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And Dawn, I would assume, since you've done so many of these agreements, that there is a very standard set of procedures that you go through when you're working on a new project.
Yes, we have our standard template that we've used, on pretty much all of them. If there's something that is of particular concern to whomever we're working with, we'll have that discussion and see what we can accommodate or not, and what the ramifications are. But yeah, we have set procedure and set document that we use on all of the licenses.
Thank you. Dawn, another question for you. You're very popular, not surprised. Is there an established relationship between utilities, tourism at the state level, and advocates to advance public use of utility land for trails around the state?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, just the Route of the Badger and working with the Rails to Trails Conservancy is the only thing that I'm aware of, at least in Wisconsin.
Got it. Something to put on your very long to-do list, right? All right, so we are running out of time, so we'll have to start wrapping this up. One more good question we received: are there issues that arise when the utility needs to do maintenance that might affect the trail? How is that addressed?
Was that to me again?
That would be to you, and Silas, you might also have something to say on this one.
Yeah, so there again, it's working with the municipality. We do have that documented in our agreements when we do need to access to do maintenance. Again, putting up barriers to keep everybody safe. And at times we do have to close the trails, but it's pretty few and far between. Again, we try to have at least a 15-year plan out so that we're not impacting that trail once it's in for at least 15 years, unless some emergency situation would come up.
Mary, you go ahead. You probably have more practical advice. I was going to give some theoretical comment.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, as land managers that permit utility companies, we do ask for an annual operating plan so that we understand what activities any utility is going to take within that given year or that operational season, whether that's summer or winter. And then we're planning and educating accordingly. So again, some of these activities, it's a one-day closure. Other activities, it is a more sustained closure, and or we are seeing more significant impacts to the trail feature itself. So on our side, we are visiting annually with our utility companies, just trying to understand what's in their program of work or what's on their plan for the year, and then working with our general public so that to educate them and keep them safe as well.
I was just going to say that, I think a big piece of how any partner that's accessing a trail is going to treat it has to go back to how they look at that trail as, being important or unimportant, how policymakers look at that trail, how local politicians and business owners look at that trail. Because, in the same way that we wouldn't shut down a busy street that gets a lot of logistics traffic, we shouldn't shut down a trail that's sustaining a lot of communities through trail use or providing recreation. So I think it just goes back to elevating the idea that I can only speak for Pennsylvania. Here in Pennsylvania, recreation is a $29 billion industry. We shouldn't be doing things that shut down or hamper that industry. And so as we are working on these rights of way, we have to consider the economic benefits of them in the same way that we do accessing any other transportation corridor. But obviously that's a culture that takes time to build.
Absolutely. That is a wonderful point to end on. Trails are critical pieces of infrastructure and should be treated as such. All right. Well, Mary, Dawn, and Silas, thank you so much for serving as wonderful panelists today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone watching did as well. So I'd encourage everyone to check out our toolbox page on our website. It was recently updated, and it features all three of our panelists' projects. And again, thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon.